So having been born into this world, we need to be wise with regards to the world, because if we don't have wisdom, then we'll always be running after the things that we experience, and we won't have any peace or calm. We'll never meet with a true form of happiness. So everyone who takes birth here in this world wants to meet with gain, with wealth and status and praise, happiness, that we want to only have these things. But if we look into this matter, then we can understand that we don't just get these things. You can ask that those people who meet with happiness have a lot of happiness. Do they not have any suffering at all? Or those who gain praise, do they only experience happiness from that praise? Is that all that they get? Because all of these dhammas, these worldly dhammas, they abide under the law of anicca, dukkha, anatta, of inconstancy, stress, not self. Any happiness that we experience, that'll have to degenerate and fade. Any suffering also fades away, and this is the nature of these worldly dhammas, the loka dhammas. They're the dhammas that characterize this world. So, having been born into this world, we need to meet with these things. Sometimes, or it's normal for us to only want the side of the loka dhammas, the worldly dhammas that we like, and not to get the things that we don't like. But we have to have both of them. And even when we do meet with the pleasurable or the likable side of the worldly dhammas, this just turns into a cause for us to experience suffering in the future. So the Buddha taught us that when we are born into this world, we have to meet with these things. So we should develop mindfulness, we should develop wisdom to prevent the mind from running after and chasing these things. The mind is something that is centered and in the middle, just like clear water. And if we have a glass of clear water and we put yellow dye into it, then it turns yellow. If there's a red color put in, then it turns red, or green, then it turns green. And that's because the dye and the water are mixed together. And so it is with our minds. When they experience any emotion or mood, then they get mixed up with that, and they become angry, they become despondent, they become upset or happy, elated. They start loving things or hating things. And this is because the mind mixes together with all of this. And so that's what happens when we go and attach to any of these emotions. Then the mind mixes up with them, and the mind turns into something that that arises and then lasts and then ceases. And it doesn't experience that original purity. But if we have mindfulness and we're able to let go of these feelings that we're experiencing, we relieve the attachment that we have, we release our grip, then we'll come back to the original pure nature of the mind that it was like before. So how do we do that? Or what do we do then once it's reached the state of purity? Well, we have to carry on looking after it, try to maintain the state of brightness and openness. And we do that through developing the 5 palas, the 5 powers or strengths, that of faith, of energy, of mindfulness, and samadhi, and wisdom. So as we're sitting in meditation, like we are right now, then we're developing the qualities of wisdom and of samadhi, of collectedness of mind. And then through the generous acts that we do, we develop the quality of effort and of faith. But why is it that sometimes in our practice we slip up, or these qualities slip away from us? Well, that's because our mindfulness, our collectedness of mind, and our wisdom doesn't have sufficient strength. And so when we experience a mental object, then the mind will go and attach to it. And at that point, we should be very careful. We can make the comparison between the mind and a cow. And so it's normal for cows to like to go and eat rice. And it needs a herder there, or someone to look after it, to stop it from going and eating all the crops. Because if it gets into the crops, then that'll be a cause for great dispute and a lot of suffering to arise. So we need to look after this cow. And just as a cow needs a herder to look after it, so our minds need this one who knows, looking after, to stop the mind from going and running after and consuming all of these sense experiences that it comes into contact with. But if our mind has already gone and chased after them, then we need to instruct it, to teach it. Because sometimes we're quick enough to catch it, and sometimes we're not. And when we're not, then we need a teaching method that will allow us to let go, to put down the things that we've clung to. We need to bring up mindfulness so that we can see into the true nature of these things, see into the nature of happiness and suffering, and see how when we attach, this is a cause of suffering. So we can use this mindfulness and our wisdom to solve the problems that we've gotten into through attaching. If there's discernment that comes up and imbues the heart, then we'll be able to solve any inner difficulty, and we'll come to a state of peace. This calm that has arisen through our practice and the presence of mindfulness and wisdom. We'll be able to reach the true heart of the teachings of the Dhamma, seeing that there's really no being, no self, no me, no other, that all of this is merely convention, supposition. There was one time that a teacher was walking along through the countryside with one of his students, and they passed a bull by the side of the path. And then later on, the teacher turned around and asked the student, "Did you see that cow, that female cow?" But really, it was a bull that was standing there. And the student was very confused, and he was certain that he saw a bull. So he started to argue with his teacher, saying, "No, it was a bull." And the teacher said, "No, it was a cow." And they went back and forth like this. And in the end, the teacher gave the student the lesson that he was trying to teach. He said, "Cows and bulls, are they actually real? Male and female, do they actually exist?" He was teaching to the very highest level of Dhamma that there really isn't any true self in any of it. He was teaching that if the mind goes and attaches, that'll be a cause for us to suffer. For all beings who have taken birth into this world, all of us meet with difficulties, with old age, with sickness, with death. And so seeing this, we should bring up feelings of kindness towards all beings. that it's natural for us to have many emotions, to love some people, to hate others, but we should try and develop kindness towards everyone, wishing for everyone to experience happiness. But why is it that when everyone wants to be happy, why do we often not feel that way? It's because of the quality of ignorance that is firmly embedded in our hearts. These qualities are different things, though. The kilesas are one thing, the kindness in our heart is another thing, the Dhamma is another thing. So we should try to give rise to as much Dhamma as we can, because the Dhamma and the defilements are constantly struggling with one another. And how much suffering we experience in our life depends on which has more power. And if the Dhamma is very weak and the kilesas are very strong, then we'll meet with much grief and pain. And for us, we've been spun around in the cycle of samsara, of birth and death, for an extremely long time now. And the kilesas have always led the mind through this process and led it to each birth that it's taken. Whether we've taken a human birth or the mind goes up into the deva realms or it falls down lower, it's always that the mind is following the orders of the defilements. And there isn't much intelligence. We're not intelligent when we do that. So we should contemplate and see that really it's not smart to just allow the mind to be under the control, under the sway of the defilements constantly. And seeing that, we should try to build up some intelligence and carry on building this, developing it little by little. Building up merit and goodness, developing our generosity, cultivating our hearts, and bringing up forbearance. So we can struggle with all of the feelings that we have, all these feelings of self and of ego. And through that, we'll slowly feel peace of mind, and the heart will start feeling very full, full of joy and happiness. And so this is the way for lay people to practice, to carry on like this, to have a lot of patience and endurance, to have truthfulness there in the heart as well, and to bring up the Dhamma so that it can be in charge of the mind. And that even though at times greed, hatred, and delusion are very strong, we need to use this Dhamma to suppress them and endure, forbear. And so sometimes when we do this, then both we also bring up this quality or cultivate the practice of sacrifice. So we can sacrifice through our physical actions, we can sacrifice in our hearts, and we can also give up the wealth that we have in order to cultivate the Dhamma. We sit meditation, we chant, and the opportunity that we have right now to do this is a very fortunate opportunity. We're very fortunate to have gained it. It's a lot of merit that we have the time to meditate. And even though we may have a lot of wealth, that wealth we can't take with us. Because one day we're going to have to pass away. But if we do build up a lot of goodness and we train ourselves in meditation and chanting every single day, then it's possible that just at the moment of death, then a vision will arise of us sitting in meditation. And the joy that we experience from seeing that vision will lead us up to the heaven realms. So we should build up goodness and skillful acts. And this forms into a noble wealth that's there in our hearts. And it's not easy for us to have gained this human birth and to have met with the teachings of the Buddha. Just before or not long ago, Ajahn Karuniko, he gave a Dhamma talk saying that there are 60 million people in England, but if you take all of the English monks who are both in England and around the world, it only amounts to 60 monks. So that's 1 in a million who are able to ordain. And for those people who consider themselves Buddhist, it's not a high percentage of the population at all. It's maybe about 1 out of every 100,000 people. So even though England is a very materially developed country, and they have the merit to have the kind of mindfulness and worldly wisdom to be developed in material ways, and still that can't free the people there from suffering. If we can compare it with this country, with Thailand, even though it's not so materially well off, and even though if you take the wage that someone gains in this country and convert that to English pounds, it'll amount to very little. But still very close to the teachings of the Buddha, and very fortunate in that way. So being born in a very affluent country can be quite similar to getting born in the higher realms of existence, and that there's a lot of ease and happiness. And when there's too much ease, then it can make the practice very difficult, because things are just so pleasant and there's no endurance and there's no motivation to practice. But in Thailand, it's easier in a way because things here are more difficult for the people. And this is a Buddhist country, and most people here have met with the teachings of the Buddha. And it's a great boon, a great fortune for these people to have this opportunity to be so close to the teachings. The reason that we come to practice is because we've seen the danger in the cycle of birth and death. And for myself, it took me quite a long time to gain the motivation to practice. And even though my house was very close to a forest monastery, and my relatives were those who helped to build the monastery, still I wasn't very interested. The monks would walk past my house on alms round every day, and I didn't have the motivation to give them any food. But I was still quite young then. I was less than 20 years old, and so just didn't really have that interest in practicing the teachings of the Buddha. You could see that it just wasn't my time yet. I hadn't reached the time to develop this interest. And sometimes we can get kind of annoyed at other people, seeing that they're full of greed, hatred, and delusion, but they're not interested in giving that up. They're not interested in the practice. But we have to respond by saying that they just haven't reached their time. It's not ripe yet. And just like us before, we weren't interested in the practice before. And that was because we hadn't seen the dangers in the cycle of samsara. But when we come to see that, then we'll gain the energy to practice and we'll understand the truth. And it's really amazing, this Dhamma, what it can do to us, how it can change our minds. And this is what happened to myself. Through seeing the nature of arising and ceasing with my inner eye. When I walked into a Dhamma hall, I could see it as just arising, lasting, and ceasing. I could see the poles that held up the roof as decaying. And it's really difficult to stay in the world when you see things in that way. I went to work and saw all the people around me like they were running towards death. Like everything was going at an exceptionally fast speed and everyone was just moving towards their death. But really everyone was just working, going about their day in a normal way. But my mind would see things like this. I got the feeling like my house was on fire. And when you feel like that, it's really difficult to stay in the world. It feels like um, the end of life or death is very close by. So just like when you realize your house is on fire, you desperately search for a way out. Um, and so we come to question this whole process of attachment. Now, what's it like attaching? What does that do to us? What's that suffering like? And when the mind releases from that attachment, when it lets go, then what kind of happiness does it experience? You can see all of these things within our own hearts and compare them. The happiness that comes from generosity, from morality, from cultivating and developing our minds, brings about a lightness and a buoyancy in our minds and hearts. And this is a mind that is similar to that of a deva. So realizing all this, we try to find our way out. We try to find an exit route. But sometimes the mind goes and attaches, and it can't find a way out. It's gone and clung on. But at that point, we need to bring up the Dhamma, and we need to use the Dhamma. We see that even though there is this clinging, we need to try and practice, and we need to bring up our endurance. And slowly as we do this, the mind will start to change. It'll change from being a putojana, one who's very thick with the defilements, into a kalyanachana, one who has a beautiful mind, one whose mind is very good. So this comes from the practice that we have of developing our body and speech, of developing our hearts. And slowly the mind becomes more beautiful. Our bodily actions and our verbal actions become more beautiful. And the mind begins this process of change. It turns into a heart that's imbued with generosity and with faith and with morality. And then from that very good heart, it transforms into a noble heart, the heart of an Arya. Perhaps in this life we may not have the energy to get to that point, but if we carry on and we keep on with the practice, then we will get there at some point. We will reach our goal, which is peace of mind, Nibbana. So in truth, what all of us are doing right now is we're steadily walking towards Nibbana, little by little. As we abandon, as we let go, then we're slowly entering into the city of Nibbana. And so Nibbana can be compared to a crystal city. And this is using Rupa Dhamma, like a physical comparison or analogy for Nibbana. But it's a way of talking about Nibbana that people like and that inspire us to want to go there. Because we like that, don't we? You know, a very bright crystal city, a place full of happiness. We can compare Nibbana to being like this. We can start getting an idea of what kind of happiness that must be like, going into the city of Nibbana. So how is it that we get there? How is it that we go through the gates? Well, we develop this very path of generosity, of morality, of cultivation of the mind, of endurance, having kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And these are all the qualities that start to imbue the heart. And these grow and grow within our hearts until they become full. And when they're full, then that is when we reach Nibbana.